morning and welcome to this webinar on entering the webinar. Is going to be more of a sort of fireside chat with very few actual PowerPoint slides. And so what I'm going to be doing is asking each of our three speakers 6 questions based around themes that have come in as being the most interesting areas to talk about. But please do put in any questions that you have at any time during the webinar and use the Q&A box, please. But before I go any further, could I please ask a few people just to put yes in the chat box if you can hear me? Thank you. Brilliant. Lovely, thanks very much. So just to be clear, the chat box is for any messages, but for questions, use the Q&A box. Thanks very much. So our guests today are Sally Coulthart, Robin Bacon and Andy Brown. And I'm just going to give information about each of them, just to give you a bit of background. So when I first met Sally 3 years ago, she was a reservist army officer near spanning regular service, part-time and full-time reserve service, as well as 10 years working on the retraining programs for unemployed service personnel, the Royal British Legion. Sally has worked predominantly in military education training and latterly personnel strategy and policy, with an interest in cross-government programs for resettling personnel, specifically those who are wounded, injured and sick. After our first discussion in 2017, Sally embarked on an MSc in nature-based therapy. And in 2019, she was awarded a Churchill Fellowship, which enabled her to travel to the USA and Denmark, where she researched horticultural therapy for armed forces personnel with the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. She's now using her findings to develop a network of veteran-friendly gardens in the UK. Sally joins us today to share her experiences of moving into self-employment in the not-for-profit sector, the development of the Defence Gardens Scheme in 2019, and its launch as a community interest company in January next year, 2021. And she can explain to those that are interested for the CIC, and along with some advice for others based on her own journey. So Robin Bacon, who is the Chief of 2010, served in the British Army for 32 years, starting as a logistician in Germany during the Cold War. Robin's military career to Hong Kong, to Africa with the UN, and with NATO in the Falklands. So upon retiring from the Army in 2010, Robin joined what was then called the Army Benevolent Fund as the Chief of Staff, and it's a similar role to a Chief Operating Officer in the private sector. So the charity, which is now called the ABF Soldiers Charity, is the British Army's national charity supporting soldiers, veterans and their families when in need. Robin has learned a great deal since his transition into the not-for-profit sector, and I'm sure you will find his insights enlightening. Finally, Andy Brown. Now bursar at Battle Abbey School, Andy left the Army almost 4 years after almost 24 years in the Royal Artillery, retiring as a Lieutenant Colonel in the summer of 2014. He then built his commercial acumen during 3 years with PwC as Head of Resourcing and Workforce Planning Tax. And his not-for-profit experience was gained when he supported as Director of Planning and Deployment, where his key achievements included the financial planning and management of 16 million annual budget for charitable and funds. He designed from fresh a Directorate Risk and Compliance Register, also ensuring full regulatory statutory compliance and ability to support transformational change and drive continuous improvement. Having transformed himself out of a job, he then spent the next 4 months working with the board and trustees and senior leadership team as transformational manager of Shaw Trust. Andy is described with a track record in leading multidisciplinary teams and managing change in the most complex business environments. Off by asking our first question to Sally. Sally, what was the impetus for you choosing the not-for-profit sector?
Jo, thank you. Some time ago now, probably about 2017, looking back on it, I was asked to be the chair of a local charity up in East Lothian in Scotland, which was delivering therapeutic horticulture. And whilst I was very interested in that area, I didn't know much about it. And I thought, I can't really take this role on without learning about it. So I went to visit a garden in Northern Ireland that I'd been told was best practice. And I was particularly interested. They were working for the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland. They did have the data. They had taken 120 people through, including veterans and including prison officers working in the prison sector in Northern Ireland. And they definitely had the data on showing statistically significant reductions in some common mental health and more severe mental health areas. And it really struck me talking to the project leader there. She recommended, you're not going to do anything serious in this world unless you're qualified. This was the August before an academic year starting in September. She recommended the diploma at Coventry University. And I was suddenly left with, do I start this academic year or next academic year? I had my enhanced learning credits that I came to see you about, various courses and what I might do. And so very quickly I was upsold by Coventry to do a master's, and the journey really started there and doors started to open. So that's how it started, just by that invitation and following that lead.
Thank you, Sally. If you'd like to answer the same question, please. What was your impetus for choosing the not-for-profit sector?
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, welcome everybody. Good to see the selection of Army, Navy, Air Force in the audience today. Clearly, I worked in a number of tri-service posts in the strategic sort of welfare arena, which is quite a rarefied, unique sort of area for my last 10 years of service after command. What was then called service personnel policy. It's gone through lots of different iterations. I was responsible for merging what was then the Service Personnel Veterans Agency from the veterans piece, the War Pensions Agency up in Blackpool and so on. So I got a real handle on veterans. I've always had massive empathy for veterans. It's seeing some of my soldiers that I had the privilege of leading and commanding over the years, falling on hard times. And so my empathy for them. And so I was very drawn towards the third sector, and this opportunity came up for me 10 years ago, nearly 11 years ago now, in the Soldiers Charity, as was the crusty old ABF at the time. I'm still there, it's been fantastic, but it's a real strength of feeling of having served. And I think that goes for everybody who's watching today. You have that empathy and link with your soldiers, for better or for worse, and you just can't help feeling, well, what are they doing now? And do they need any assistance? They need any help? Need any coaching? They need a hand up or anything with what they're doing in life? And so that's why I chose the not-for-profit sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. I'd like to move on to Andy now, if you wouldn't mind answering the same question. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Jo. I'm going to break the mold slightly and say I didn't necessarily choose the not-for-profit sector deliberately. It was more a matter of looking for another opportunity from the job I was in. And the opportunity came knocking in terms of working in a charity such as Macmillan Cancer Support. But I think the three things that resonate with me when looking at that next opportunity as to why I then chased after the opportunity at Macmillan was around the brand. Fantastic organisation, fantastic brand in terms of its reputation, what it does. About the purpose, not just of the organisation, but of the function that I was looking at. And also the role itself. It was dynamic, it was new, it was exciting, it was exploring something I'd never experienced before. And really just to sort of quantify that, as if to say I fell into the role by accident. Appropriate research. I looked at charities, I looked at the not-for-profit sector as part of my research and thought, there's a couple of things that tick the box that I was missing in my life, so to speak, in my working life, having left the military, and it was the brand, the purpose, and the role in terms of that sort of public benefit that charities, in particular, not-for-profit sector, can offer.
Thanks, Andy. I think you've answered some of the second question a little bit as well, which is what preparation did you find invaluable? So certainly research, and I'm sure that everybody did a great deal of research. What else did you do, Andy, if I can start with you for this one, in preparation? Were there any particular training courses, or did you embark on any work experience or anything else that you found really invaluable for your preparation into the not-for-profit sector?
Sure. It sounds cliched, particularly in a forum like this, which is very much about networking, but it is about networking. I knew very little about Macmillan, other than what one could read and hears about in the public sector. I knew very little about charities and how charities work and not-for-profit sector. And through the network that Office Association provide and other networks, I contacted a lot of people, ex-military, who work in service charities and likewise, just to understand a bit more about charities, to understand a bit about the opportunities, just like we're doing now, to speak to people who have lived it, to see whether it's something as an ethos, as a culture that I'd be comfortable with. Less so on the qualifications and the courses in terms of preparation, but I think that's dependent on the type of role. And on reflection, I think it's previous experience that really sort of set me up in terms of making it a success and giving it a good go. But I would say go and talk to people and find out what it's like to work in the charitable sector, stroke not-for-profit sector, because limited experience in commercial world, it's a very different in many cases, but also quite similar. But exploring that and speaking to people, you can't. There's no substitute for that.
Thanks, Andy. I actually just wanted to mention that one of our listeners, Mike Weymouth, has just put in a question here. CTP charities, on balance, is it better to do the course or to simply volunteer to help to learn? And I think you sort of alluded to that, but I just wondered what your thoughts. Just moving. Well, Andy, if you'd like to add something, and then we'll ask the rest of the panel.
Sorry, Joe, could you repeat the question? It was difficult with there was some interference.
I do apologise if the reception's not very good. Doing my best. We're just talking about CTP run a charity management awareness course, which is a 5-day course. Do you think on balance that it's better to do the course or to simply job? There's also a note to actually be leaving at the moment.
Sure, I'm not familiar with the course, so I couldn't really comment on the details of that. I think an obvious solution is perhaps a blended mix of doing the course and getting some practical volunteering experience. There's absolutely no harm in doing some work shadowing if the opportunities arise, or indeed volunteering in certain organisations if they're up for that. I think the risk with volunteering is it then becomes quite a low level task, and you might not get a flavour, depending on what level you're looking to enter, of sort of the management, the broader responsibilities. But I think anything you can do to before you leap into the sector, to get familiar with what the challenges are and get to know it, I think has got to be an advantage.
I might go to Sally now to respond to that one, because I know that you have great interest or volunteering in the.
Thank you, Joe. I have to say that the connection is really quite poor, so it's really quite crackly, and I may be suffering from that myself. So I have done the Effective Charity Management course in June of this year, and I highly recommend it. I did the first online one, but there was no problem with that at all. There were 8 of us on it. It was run by the National Council of Voluntary Organisations, and it was excellent. And as a result of it, I actually acquired an RAF sergeant, special investigations policeman, who's volunteering for me in a sort of head office role. So I agree with Andy about being careful about how you're volunteering and using your time. But if you talk to charities, I'm sure you'll be able to find roles that give you the right experience, as well as just use your time to their benefit. And I highly recommend both. And I'm benefiting from my volunteer.
Thanks, Sally. And we will have a slide later on with just some details of some volunteering opportunities, both with Sally and also with Rural Link. I might pass to Robin now, please.
Thank you, Jo. I've got a sort of slightly different approach to this in terms of that preparation that I found absolutely invaluable. Clearly, there's your work experience, but actually, you can't be expert in everything. And I really think, looking again at the audience today, all of whom probably have learning credits, enhanced learning credits to use. And by goodness, if you haven't done something like the Manchester Business School course or the IOD Certificate in Company Direction, then you're really missing a trick, because these give you a broad brush. You're not going to become an accountant overnight, but you do things. There are subjects like finance for senior managers and so on, which is a 2 or 3 day sort of bluffer's guide, so you know your way around a balance sheet and so on, which I'm sure Andy as the bursar knows intimately. But for most people in the military, actually, whether you're an HLB, BLB, whatever you are holder, you're not really a financial expert. And so the ability to read an annual report and understand it without reading all the text and that sort of thing is really, really helpful. I was grilled by the chief executive of a bank in the city. He was one of my trustees, and he was the chairman of the panel when I took the job. And I had this IOD certificate in company direction paid for by the MOD through learning credits and so on. I did have an MBA from before, and that's always useful because you can put everything into 4 boxes if you do an MBA. Everything to do with marketing, everything's 4 boxes, and you can sort of bluff your way with that. But I do recommend one of these sort of courses. The other thing I'd say is, clearly not being an expert in everything, is that depending on the size of the charity you go to, I mean, I looked at, Andy went to Macmillan. Macmillan's a huge charity. I mean, my charity is a large for a service charity. We're very similar to the RF Ben Fund. We're a bit bigger than the RN RMC, but we're broadly the same, and we work very closely together. But where I found the experience really valuable and understanding how to work with trustees, because trustees are the be and end all of the not-for-profit sector, is actually being a trustee myself in a small charity. Now, I know a lot of you will probably be trustees in an ex officio capacity. So you're the, you're the assistant director such and such, and therefore you're put on that board. When I was in service personnel, I was put on the board of the King Edward VII Hospital, which was a revelation to me. And actually, I didn't really enjoy it very much because I felt it was a bit too exclusive, and I didn't see why they were doing what they were doing. But anyway, but it was a stepping stone. And the experience I then had of working in I'm a trustee of a number of very small charities with only 3 or 4 trustees, working in the low thousands of pounds a year. And by goodness, you learn so much about if you're working in a small charity with your hands on, you're writing the begging letters, the letters for fundraising for a grant for £1,000 from the local council or whatever it might be. And that's where you learn what it's like to be a trustee. And so whatever you're doing in the not-for-profit sector, on the basis you're a paid employee you're going into, whether you're the chief exec or my role or whatever other roles that there might be, actually understanding firsthand what it's like to be a trustee with proper hands-on experience. So fine, be ex officio with your appointment to be on the Army Central Fund or the Air Force Central Fund or whatever it might be, but actually do something really hands-on. And the others, talked about volunteering. I think that's wonderful. But I look at the volunteers that help us in the counties, and very similar for other service charities. And people will go out and do things, they'll organise an event, they'll organise a concert and so on. And all that's all good experience, and don't get me wrong. But actually being a trustee, if you can be a trustee, then that's the best possible experience. I had a couple of these under my belt, and it really helped me hugely on interview going into easing that passage in, because trustees want to know that you understand them. I probably banged on a bit about that, but I really think it's important. So 2 things: use your learning credits, get yourself a Manchester course, or it can be the Henley one, just enough, not to be an expert in everything, but to give that broad brush of of sort of business skills which you then need, so you can be intelligent when you're talking about these subjects, because they're very wide. I mean, I have, like Andy, you know, a lot of responsibility for all sorts of things which I didn't necessarily want to be responsible for. So as a data protection officer, I can't say that's my enjoyable part of my portfolio. And doing the GDPR 1 week course, I think I'd rather be waterboarded than do that again. You know, it was horrendous. But it's one of those things that you know, that you have to do, and so just so you can be intelligent, you can talk to the IT team intelligently, you can talk to the database team intelligently, and without being completely wrapped up with all their language. So yeah, that's my advice on that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Just in the first couple of questions, it's terrific. Somebody's just asked about the charity. That's the name of it, Jason, and you'll find it on the CTP website. You go in there and you can book onto it for 5 days. Great, thank you. So the next question is, what did you learn once you started in the role? How did you have to adjust? And I think, Robin, you've already sort of alluded to that quite a bit. So should we start with you, Robin, with that question, please?
Sure, no, thank you. I think the big thing when I started, I mean, we weren't a very big charity. You know, we only had less than 50 staff at the time, and we were going through quite a sort of change because we went through rebranding and so on as well. And as one of 50 members of staff, you realise you have a very big portfolio of things to cover. And I mentioned before, you know, the wonderful responsibilities for data and other enjoyable things like that. But actually, what I did learn very quickly was how to really hone the skill that we learned in the military, and that's that doer-delegator balance, as in doer, not as in miserable, as in doing yourself and delegating. And so often, and I find it right now, because we're all going through, you know, living through the pandemic crisis, and we're doing all sorts of things, and there's some things that I just can't delegate, and I need to do it myself. And quite often things are actually easier to do yourself if you've got that experience. I had, you know, lots and lots of experience in my sort of senior part of my career in the MOD, which is very, very relevant. And I think, well, I can do that. And it's much quicker to do it yourself. But unless you give someone the opportunity and try that, you know, teach them and instruct them and so on, I mean, it's really good for them. And of course, it's really good for you, because once they get the hang of it, then you can then step back and they get on with it. And so it was really trying to get that doer-delegator balance. And you can't just delegate to people if you don't understand it. And it goes back to that point about being a reasonably intelligent sort of customer for the different functions. But you do have to, you know, roll your sleeves up and actually be prepared to be as patient as possible when you get someone will produce a draft business case for something and you despair and you want to rip it up and throw it in the bin, but you've got to use all your emotional intelligence to sort of channel their enthusiasm and help them construct a framework for the sort of business case for what they want to do. And so I think that was the thing I learned, and I had to adjust most, because in the military I was surrounded by competent people. Some exceptions, obviously, but for the most part, I think back, I look at quite a big contingent from the army. You know, as a commanding officer, you're surrounded by really good people, where you ought to be, and so they help you do things and move things along. You're not in isolation. But in a charity, you haven't got too many people to turn to except your network, and so I network very closely with my opposite numbers in the other service charities, in the other big Ben funds, and that's really helpful. We share things, we share information, we share legal advice on different issues and so on, because that saves money, because legal advice is expensive. But I think this whole thing of where do you sit on that seesaw of doing and delegating, and it's not fixed. There are times like now, like any other organization, you know, we're looking at whatever the Chancellor is going to give out in furlough terms, and there's hardly a charity not affected by or not thinking about, should we furlough, should we not, you know, to sort of to take advantage of Rishi's largesse and so on, and to help. And some of these things like that, you know, you can't delegate. But otherwise, if you don't delegate, you get completely buried in too much detail. So it's just trying to find, it's a constant sort of seesaw that you have to try and keep it in equilibrium. But doing and delegating are the things I think are most important. and you all have it. You've had it in your military careers. You've had sort of shiny, if you're a commanding officer, you've got sort of shiny company commanders who you can get on with things, and those who you don't want to give them to, but actually you do need to give them to them, because actually it helps you and it helps them develop, and you then get their loyalty and they develop and so on as well. So yeah, that's my long-winded answer to that, but it's I passionately believe in it, clearly. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Robin. I might go to Andy now for that question. So what did you learn once you started in the role, and how did you have to adjust, Andy?
Sure. The one thing that surprised me, and it sounds naive to say, having come from working in professional services for 3 years and then stepped into a large national charity like Macmillan, it surprised me actually how charities are very much a business and need to be run as a business. So all the things I'd seen in PwC in terms of looking at the bottom line, looking at the spreadsheets that Robin talked about, looking at processes, looking at compliance, all need to be in place. And I suppose it was managing my own expectations when you step into the charitable sector as to what you're stepping into. But we're talking, in Macmillan's case, of a 240 million, 250 million pound business that generates that income, and due to its shareholders, members of the public predominantly, is accountable for spending that money and spending it in the right way, just like any other business would need to operate in. And I guess it was not really knowing what I was stepping into from that perspective that made me sit back and think, actually, all the things I've learned through my military career and indeed subsequently in the couple of years since leaving the military, all apply to a charity, no matter how big or small it is. And you could broaden that across the not-for-profit sector in terms of the governance and how that organisation, call it a charity, call it a business, doesn't really matter, how that organisation needs to operate. And I think that's where we can really add value as ex-military folk or people leaving the military. I was slightly nervous about stepping out from a military network, a community that existed obviously through military career, and then into PwC, where they had a military network as part of the corporate covenant piece of work, into an organisation that actually didn't have any military. There was no military network. I wasn't being hired for any military skills. I was being hired for the value I was bringing and how that might land. And actually, it's holding true to what you have got, the skill set you've got, and applying that common sense that Robin's talked about. We still had to do GDPR. We still had to do performance management. We still had to look at how HR functioned, all the things we're all familiar with, the basics of operating as a unit, as an organisation, as a business. And I suppose in terms of adjustment, it was understanding that for me, the people in the workforce were there for very different reasons, a whole multitude of reasons within a charity such as Macmillan, be it because it was a job that they valued doing because of what it gave them, be it because they liked working in the charitable sector and they were what I would call lifers in Macmillan, people who had worked in the charitable sector since literally they left school, and that's all very credit-worthy and valuable. There were people who wanted to work for Macmillan because of what Macmillan does. There were people who were working for Macmillan because they'd had a personal experience. All very commendable reasons, and no one size fits. And I guess that's a learning in life in terms of why people work for an organisation. But it was quite true in Macmillan. There were different causes and motivations, and understanding then how you motivate people based on their motivations was really quite insightful for me in terms of how you get the best out of the workforce.
Thank you so much, Andy. I'm going to move to Sally. I saw you nodding your head during some of the comments from Andy. So over to you, Sally, with that.
Thank you very much, Jo. And I very much like this order because basically I was nodding my head all the way through Robin and nodding my head all the way through Andy. So that makes life very easy. I would completely underline, it's a useful moment for me to reflect as I go through this egg timer of moving from a regional project in Northern Ireland to my next region and then the subsequent, this doer delegate balance. And as I build the team for when we launch the CIC, the Community Interest Company in January, it's so difficult. It's so tempting to do it yourself because you delegate it and then you get 12 questions about what do you actually want them to do. But I know I can't do it all. And I have definitely found that over the summer. So I completely reinforce that. And also, I am very clear, and I'm, again, Andy's reiterated, but I'm very clear in setting this up. I am setting up a business. I'm setting this up. I believe we're entering a COVID decade. I'm setting this up with a 5-year business plan, and I want to build a funding strategy to develop a nationwide network over a 5-year period. So I've certainly picked up that probably, as well as that effective charity management course, which I recommended, I need to go back with my last third of my enhanced learning credits and do one of Robin's recommendations in Manchester, or the other one I forget. So I reinforce both of those, and I'll just pick up on one question, which I think I work very much supporting very grassroots charities, so very grassroots charities who want to deliver nature-based therapy, or veterans charities that want to deliver, as I say, green care. And so one of the panelists, somebody's asked, is there any suspicion of military people? And it is difficult, because it is easy to think, I know how you should be running your charity and this is what you need to be doing, and they are motivated by different things. They do work at a different pace, and so just getting that balance. And interestingly, on the fellowship, and I went east coast to the west coast of the States visiting veterans charities, and it was the same. Congress was trying to bring in a nationwide program across the States, and there were a lot of grassroots charities which engaged with the government money that was coming down. And then once they started to see the data they had to collect and the sort of bureaucracy, after about 6 months, they said, thank you, I'm going back to, doing what I was doing. And I like the government money, but not enough to want to get into, that sort of formality. So I do think at that level, I'm not talking necessarily at, organizations like ABF, but working in the community-based sector, you do have to build those relationships, and they do take time, and they could see you with suspicion, even if you're very well motivated.
Thanks, Sally. I might stay with you for the next question. I think a lot of this has been sort of alluded to, but in hindsight, what did you find was most challenging in the early days? And what did you learn from that?
Well, I think even though I'm 3 years in, I've been delivering the intervention that we run in Northern Ireland for 2 years. I would say I'm still in the early days. So I would say it is very rewarding. It is very hard work, but it is a fantastic world to work in. And certainly for me, being in charge of my own train set, and I've thought long and hard about whether I would move forward in this environment. And so having decided to do it, I'm still learning all the time. So nothing really to add to what we've all been saying.
Fantastic, thank you. Might just move to Andy. What did you find most challenging, already mentioned, in the early days, and what did you learn from that?
I think 3 things, and they're all interlinked. The one thing that struck me, we all are familiar with Macmillan Cancer Support. You see the adverts, you see the coffee mornings, you're familiar with the cause. But actually, when I stepped in through the front door, I suddenly realized how complex it is in terms of what an organisation like Macmillan does, both from how it's funded, how it works with partnerships, not just the NHS, we know how complex that is on its own, how it designs and delivers new services. It does something like 70–85% of its work through and with partners, rather than necessarily owning the outcomes. And trying to get my head around that, I came from an organisation which prided itself on being a partnership, as was professional services, and people say that was really complex, but actually that was very simple compared to how an organisation like Macmillan works. And then, so what from that is understanding then who does what. Understanding what these different divisions were around fundraising and marketing, around service design, around innovation. We understand the words, but actually what do they do and how do they deliver that? So as an organisation, I found it one of the most complex that I've come across. I think the challenge in the early days, I had a huge learning curve, which one could say going into any job you would have. But yeah, be it my second job out of the military, you think you know a little bit, but actually going to a completely new sector, one can expect to have a huge learning curve. But with that comes excitement, because you're learning new things. You continue to challenge yourself and grow and develop. So that's not something to be feared, it's something to be embraced. And I always remember day one being told when I arrived as this new appointed Director of Planning and Deployment, that I was a milestone in someone's change programme. And for me, I'd never heard the word consultation mentioned in the corporate world or in the world outside the military, and suddenly learning that consultation made for potential redundancies, for people going through change, restructuring, everything else, and all that entails, that was literally landed in my lap on day one. So again, reinforces the learning curve and trying to understand the organisation you're working with.
Andy, thanks so much. It sounds like you had a pretty steep learning curve in your first experience in the not-for-profit sector. Robin, would you like to add to that question, please? I know that you've already mentioned some of the challenges, but is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Yes, something completely different. I mean, clearly, when I joined the organisation nearly 11 years ago, it was quite it was very old-fashioned, and I think we've all moved on, considerably in that time frame. But it was what it was in its age, as were all the service charities in many respects. And it was actually in 2010, 2011 when Help for Heroes came and gave everyone a big kick up the proverbial to sort of shake up and wake up and modernise. And that was very, very interesting. And actually we've got to be very grateful to them for having given that impetus to the whole of the sector. No, the point I was going to make actually was, regardless of what size charity, and I'm trustee of a couple of very small charities where we have just a few thousands and so on. So, but actually, whether you've got a few thousands, a few 100,000, or a few million, there's always an investment issue. How you invest it, how you look after that money. Now, I recognise that some charities have very little money at all and are a bit hand to mouth. But I don't think that the people attending today are going to be going perhaps to seek employment from someone where there's no reserves at all. So on the basis that if you do go into the NFP and you go to an organisation which does have some reserves, whether they're, and reserves are complicated because they can be designated, they can be, they can be ring fenced in all sorts of ways. But I remember going to my first investment strategy meeting with BlackRock, and I didn't understand a word of it. As a whole new lexicon of me, and I thought this is something I'm missing, because although I did my service funds like everyone probably present did, and then I did this sort of Henley course for a week of financial management and so on. So I understood that, but the investment strategy bit completely beyond me. So I mean, I did 2 tours in Hong Kong in the early part of the career, and there was my favourite pub was called the Bull and Bear. I had no idea that was the Bull and Bear was the terms, around investment strategy and so on, whether the rising or falling markets. But it was somewhere where soldiers tend to go and have a few beers and misbehave. But it was so there's that lexicon of understanding this whole new language. So if you don't know anything about investments, you go to an organisation which has investments and learn a bit about it. So at least you're not completely befuddled by it when they start talking about some of the terms that investment managers use. And the second thing I was going to say is that I learned very quickly was I ended up in my first year with a huge number of direct reports. And I suppose the most direct reports I ever had was probably as a commanding officer on operations, where you end up having attached people. So you end up with a lot of people. But then military tend to be quite self-sufficient. So they don't need to have one-to-ones all the time. But in this sort of sector, there's a great onus on one-to-ones for your direct reports, and I just got out of control in that first year. And I think there was a military rule and someone or guidance of you shouldn't really directly manage more than 6 people or 7 people, otherwise you can't give them the attention sort of it gives. But it's that they really need. But so try and hone down the number of direct reports you've got. Have other people, put other people in positions so you don't have to worry too much about it. Clearly, you have responsibility as a sort of like a second reporting officer, because in any organisation, whatever charity you're in, you've got an appraisal or performance management system. Not the same as JPA, you'll be pleased to know, because I'm not sure what JPA is called now, but it's that dreadful system that the services brought in about 15 years ago. But I'm sure it's working well now. But the point is minimize, obviously have direct reports, have influence and know all your people in the charity, but don't necessarily have direct management responsibility for them. So it can be such a burden and distraction from doing all your other things. Not being unkind about it, but you can get overwhelmed with this sort of thirst for one-to-ones. That's me on that question.
Thanks so much, Robin. Our fifth question is, what would be your top 3 tips or pieces of advice for anyone else considering this type of career? I might stay with Robin for.
Funnily enough, I was thinking about that. I'm on now, aren't I? Yeah. I was thinking about it, and the first one I'd say is, because I came straight out of the military and straight into this role, and my chief executive or control at the time was a former general officer commanding the household division and so on. So we had a certain way of working, and civilians in the military, there was a distinct sort of difference in some ways, and which was not actually terribly healthy. And the one thing that I know that people absolutely hate is they hate being called civvies, and it's something that military can do, and it's a very rude thing to do. And I apologise for using that word on air here, but don't be frightened though of. So don't use that word, but don't be frightened of bringing in terms, which suit and just abbreviate things. So for instance, I have HODS meeting, and so I know the Navy do that. The Army don't necessarily call it that, being a heads of department meeting every week. Sometimes you have it more than when we were going through the early stage of the pandemic. We're having it daily, HODS meetings. So and making people understand this is not a long-winded thing. This is a 20 minutes, 10 people. Let's get in and bang, bang, bang. Who's doing what? So people are all informed and communicate. We insist on people, because we had until earlier this year, we had mainly open plan, but we've now gone into sort of social distancing more. But I did insist on saying, if new member of staff, if they don't know the phonetic alphabet, as in the native phonetic alphabet, then they need to learn it. And so they'd have a piece of paper, on their desk. So what I'm not listening to then is someone in finance, shouting down the telephone, oh yes, that's sugar, zebra, something like that. No, it's Sierra. And so I just, and actually every single person in the charity now knows the phonetic alphabet, and it's just, I know we should be chill about these things, but it's just, it's good to do. So I remember when I introduced prayers as opposed to HODS, and people said, well, we're not religious. I said, no, it's not that, it's prayers. That's what we do. And so you've got to be wary. You've got to realize that people don't understand your language. And what they also don't understand is the way that military tend to email. If I was to email Andy in sort of service, I'd just have Andy, maybe a comma, text, one line, Robin, that's it. I wouldn't send it anything else. Whereas in the civilian world, of the charity world, I'd have to do, hi Andy, hope you're okay, and then say the thing. And if I write something, an email with lots of exclamation marks, then that's considered rude. And so you've got to think your way through and put yourself in their shoes and be chill and adapt. I suppose, so that's my biggest piece of advice coming out of the military. And then apart from prepare yourself with the transition courses, use your learning credits, get that Bluffer's Guide to Finance, so you really do know enough about it. And the other thing which I mentioned before, that getting trustee experience at grassroots level, it's the sort of things Sally's been talking about, where you've really got to roll your sleeves up and get on and do stuff. Really, really valuable. And I still have trustee experience. I've taken on new trusteeships since I started the charity and so on as well. And we encourage people to have trustee responsibility at all levels, in the middle level and the senior level, because it's really good experience for people. So whether someone wants to become a school governor, whatever, you encourage them to do it. It can be, these things can be quite time consuming, but we try and help people do it because it helps them do their job better in the charity. So that's my bits of advice. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. And there was a question that came in from Mark Rogers. Even though you had an MBA, did you still feel there was value in doing a business management course?
Yes, because my MBA, I did it when I was, correct, I did it about 15 years before. So whilst everything to do with marketing and everything being in 4 boxes was still the same, it was having something up to date. So doing the IOD course in particular, which is very similar to the Manchester course or the Henley course or the Ashridge, just short bursts. It was so you can sit a 40-minute finance exam at the end of it, and you can sit a short exam, which is multiple choice sort of type questions. Was really, really valuable, because otherwise there's a bit of skill fade from what I learned on my MBA. But if I had an MBA very recently, then I wouldn't have done both. I think you can do overkill with these things, and sometimes you see CVs with people with so many qualifications. You think, well, why do they do that, or why do they need it? But sometimes you have to do it. I guess there's a lot of people in the audience today who take part in civil service selection boards and so on, appointment boards, and in order to do it, you've got to go on the court. You're not allowed to be on the panel, the selection panel, unless you've done the civil service course on how to interview and that sort of thing. So whilst that's a qualification, and actually it's quite useful, you can stack up an awful lot of things. Like I had things like MSP practitioner, managing successful programs, which is a dreadful sort of worse version of Prince in terms of being everything was terribly American. You were either right or wrong, in terms of managing programs, and you discard a lot of that stuff. But if you have to do it, and I had to do it because of my MOD roles, doing sort of Prince and so on, and having sort of kicked against it a lot, actually some of the principles inside it are okay, as long as you don't have to be sort of completely pedantic about it. Then they're useful to do sort of going onwards. So I think get something reasonably up to date. If you've done an MBA years ago, then do something like the IOD, Henley or Manchester, because it really is very, very valuable. Does that help, hopefully?
Okay, thanks so much, Robin. Lots of detail there. Brilliant. Sally, could we move on to you for that same question? Your top 3 tips. Tips or pieces of advice for anyone else considering.
Yes, thank you, Jo. So again, I would reinforce the other 2 panelists, and there's just one piece of support we haven't mentioned. We've all mentioned the enhanced learning credits, and that really is a phenomenal amount of money, really, to be able to go and invest in your future. And clearly, as Robin has said, if you do an up-to-date one, you're not only you're also building a network, as well as getting an up-to-date qualification. So I certainly wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I hadn't done that master's, and saying in my particular case that moved on to the fellowship, which clearly augmented it. But if you're a service leaver, you've also got your civilian work attachment. And so actually being able to go and sit inside a charity, funded the travel, the subsistence, just for 3 days, I think you can do 2 or 3 civilian work attachments. So actually, if you were looking to go to one of the major charities, I don't know if Robin was ever approached, but in theory, somebody could come and do a civilian work attachment, sit inside ABF head office or Royal British Legion or SAFA, and without doing the volunteering, actually get some work experience that's funded. And I'm using that, say, with my RAF service leaver. I want him to go and see our flagship property or flagship garden in Northern Ireland. I can't ask one of my volunteers to pay for their own. I mean, obviously at the moment they can't go with the restrictions, but I can't ask a volunteer to pay their own flight to Belfast, travel down to County Fermanagh and stay in a local hotel. This RAF volunteer can do that, quite genuine use of his time. He's moving into the not-for-profit sector. And we had that funded for the 28th to the 30th of October, and we'll obviously move it forward into the new year. So I'd reinforce the enhanced learning credit, the volunteering, as I've mentioned, the civilian work attachments. And I've certainly gained just really the relationship I built up, but my relationship with my CTP senior officer mentor over the last 2 years. Jo initially, well, Jo I met through CTP before she went to the OA. just that sounding board as I've been going through my journey and getting on the bus. Am I going to do this? Getting off the bus? No, it's not the right time. And then getting back on. Just that reflection and that call once every 3 months over my transition has been invaluable.
Thanks so much, Sally. Andy, is there anything else that you would like to add to that?
It's probably adding on to what both Sally and Robin had said, but from a personal experience, I am forever amazed at the diversity of what we're calling not-for-profit stroke charitable sector. And just from personal experience, you know, I've worked for a charity, you know, a big national charity, one of the most popular charities in the UK. I've worked for a not-for-profit organisation where the chief executive is absolutely right to say it's actually we're not for loss rather than not for profit in terms of how they generate and use their income. And now I'm working for a registered charity in a school. So you've got a very eclectic mix of organisations that is just worth exploring when you talk about the not-for-profit sector. And I think there was a question earlier about the perception of military, ex-military. Don't be afraid of the perception. You don't be afraid of people might be thinking you are going to be this shouting sergeant major or this archetypal service officer leaving or transitioning from one role to another. But as Robin quite fantastically pointed out, actually use some of that knowledge, use some of that experience to bring something different to the party, be it the phonetic alphabet. And I did make a note, I'm going to start bringing that in with my staff because I think it's a great little trick. And actually people are quite taken by that sort of nuance that we bring. But there's some sort of valuable lessons and experience we can bring, but don't be afraid of using that. Obviously, I'd stop at perhaps doing, first parades or morning PT or log runs in the afternoon, but a sense of balance, because that's what people are hiring you for, your experience and your skills, but perhaps just lower the military bit, but actually bring it into the civilian context. And I would say, be yourself and not your rank. There are so many people who have either seen or experienced someone who's trying to enact their rank that they used to hold in the civilian world, and it just doesn't work. But actually being yourself in terms of who you are and being honest to you and your employer, I think is a good piece of advice. And from that perspective, I came across a bizarre situation, just as a bit of an anecdote, where I was interviewing. Well, firstly, when I turned up in Macmillan, I was suited and booted, and I was the best dressed person in the building. In terms of wearing a jacket and tie throughout my tenure. I soon lost the tie and didn't end up wearing a tie for the rest of the time there. But actually, that was the only drop in standards that one would argue I adopted. But then I became known for that, for being a relatively smart person. And I ended up doing some interviews for a fairly senior role in Macmillan as part of my team. And it was an internal candidate who turned up wearing his normal work clothes, which for him was jeans, t-shirt and jumper. And my subconscious bias immediately balked at that, but he got the job because he was the right person for the job. And that's just the diversity of the sector. You will get people who have different standards, not necessarily lower standards, but different standards to you. That doesn't necessarily mean you should drop your standards or indeed change them, but bring them to the party because that's who you are, and say being honest to yourself. So I'd say my final parting words on that is be yourself and not your rank, because I think that rings true with everything.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andy. So our next question is a pandemic, and how do we feel, how do you think the pandemic will affect those who are currently in career transition, who are looking at entering the not-for-profit sector? And before I turn to my guests, I just thought I'd mention some research that I did in preparation. For example, since the coronavirus pandemic, the third sector has been impacted significantly, with services being postponed and fundraising efforts scaled back. So we're starting to see the impact. And for example, 8 out of 10 small charities have had to alter or drop their services. So only 1 in 5 are able to provide normal pandemic, and 1 in 10 small charities expect to make redundancies. People like Macmillan, that's already been discussed, they are going to be axing apparently 310 roles. If that hasn't happened already. Help for Heroes, 142 roles are at risk and being made redundant. Treetops Hospice estimate they have had a loss of funding of 1.4 million. And Hospice UK have recorded of approximately 70 million since the beginning of March, Animal Health Trust, serious financial difficulties, Sue Ryder, etc. And of course, then the military service charities, they've actually had similar issues. Since 2016, the sector has shrunk by 133 charities and is shrinking by 44 charities each year. It's amazing how many number of charities there must be in that case. So I'll hand over. I'm sure there's much more information that my guests would share with you on that topic. So over to you, Sally, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you for those up-to-date figures, because I don't personally think it's necessarily any different than any other sector, but clearly there is a massive impact, and so as there is in other sectors of hospitality or whatever, and so I do, in terms of what do I think will happen, I do think it will make it more competitive if you're going for a formal role in the larger charities. What I think is interesting is that some of the, certainly for this period of the pandemic, so we're not yet in a steady state, but for this period, there has actually been quite a lot, well, there has been a lot of new money coming in for charities to test and adjust to the pandemic. And now actually it's quite interesting that a lot of the smaller charities who don't have the large overheads or the fixed office space and the large salaries have been able to be quite agile. So I don't think we're at the end of, or clearly not at the end of the adjustments. And on the fundraising side, it is going to be more competitive. There'll be more people chasing the same grants coming down. At the same time, certainly in my world and the veteran charities world, there's going to be an increase in demand for those services. So it certainly was part of my thinking as to whether this was the right time to move forward with a new organisation. But equally, the product and the service that we deliver is COVID resistant. It is outdoors, it is small groups, and it is very much in demand. But no, it's certainly it is something definitely to consider. But it's certainly not unique to this sector. So it shouldn't stop people continuing if they're motivated to work in this sector. Thank you, Jo.
Thanks so much. The flip side of all this is that, of course, there's been an increased demand for all of the charitable services. So those that can be agile will be in high demand too. Robin?
I'm there. Thank you very much. Yes, this whole business of the pandemic, and actually it's not just the pandemic, actually it's the whole economic sort of situation, which probably predates the pandemic, which has this massive impact on the charitable sector. But what I would say, and looking out at the audience today, there are jobs there. I mean, I'm retiring next year, and we advertised for my job through the list, which looks for military people, because although, as Andy says, you certainly don't live by your rank, it's jolly handy to have it sometimes. So I interface with people like the private officers in the royal households and so on, and they seem to like the fact that I'm a retired brigadier. I don't use it normally, and my business card doesn't have any rank on it, and it's useful sometimes. And sometimes people are impressed by it, but so what? It's actually, as Andy says, is what you can deliver and what you can do. And actually, people want you to be down to earth, and you certainly shouldn't live on the rank. But the whole thing for the sector is that there are jobs, and you can only have to look on the OA site and other sites. There's headhunters out there looking for a chief executive of Forces in Mind Trust, Combat Stress, which is going through a bit of a crunchy time. Looking for chief exec, and there are other senior posts. And whilst we're definitely in Soldiers Charity, we're gapping some junior posts. We're gapping them where we've got overlap, where we've got two people who can do. These are sort of executive level, sort of reason. So they're not terribly senior. They're sort of junior members of staff. And where you have 2 or 3 trust executives, then if you're one down, then that's it. You're one down, because we can't afford to. We'll gap. While the current situation is in, because obviously fundraising is down for everybody, and it's not just a case of the public aren't necessarily out there throwing money at things. It's the fact that the trusts and foundations, who are the bedrock of income for all the not-for-profit sector, their largesse is really restricted this year. They're looking at their own investment portfolios, and we look at our investment portfolio on a very, very regular basis, and you see it going up and down, and you think, oh my goodness, this is absolutely terrible. And it sort of came back. The news of that Pfizer vaccine, sent up, the BlackRock shares went up, so a few short moment of relief. But these trusts and foundations, they're much harder in terms of they're reluctant to give out too much money. And what people want to do now in funding is who must we fund and who could we fund? And so if you've got a number of veterans in a care home in Northumberland, then that's a must, because they're not going to get out of that without that sort of proper support that can give them. So that becomes a must, or wherever it might be, in Manchester, where it might be. But if it's a charity which is something nice to have, and I love the particular charity which we've helped in the past called Turn to Starboard, and it's a sailing charity, and sailing is a good therapy and so on, but actually, is it as essential as putting a roof over someone's head and so on? So there's some real hard decisions being made there. So if you go into the sector, into something which could be seen as nice to, or could be funded, then you're going to be struggling. You're going to be an organisation which is going to be really up against it, getting money. If you go to something where there absolutely is a real need, support to reach out to service personnel in the criminal justice system and that sort of thing, then that's a genuine need. So that's a must fund. So the organisation will then sort of exist. But these jobs are there. We still need, and I say, we still need good people, especially when they're in this sort of more middle and senior singleton posts. You can't gap some of these posts. Then you need to refresh them. So keep going and apply for these posts. And if you're applying for the military sector, don't try and do. I know the CTP will train you to change your job. So instead of being a company commander in the army or a squadron leader, or you've come out on your CV as an HR manager, and you think, well, what on earth does that mean? Is he really an HR manager? Actually, say if you're going to work and apply for any service charity, say you were a squadron leader or a company commander or a squadron leader, or whatever it might be, because then we understand what we're talking about. But I do recognise that in applying to Macmillan for a job, you have to convert. Andy will have had to convert his CV into sort of civilian speak, if you see what I mean, in that way. But in our sector, we do recognise the jobs that people have done in their military past, and despite the never-ending change of job title, I think there's a good understanding of, if we say to someone, where did you work? Oh, you worked in MS. You think, well, what's that? Is that multiple sclerosis? No, in the military, people know you mean that you work with the military secretary or the air secretary or the naval secretary, that everyone understands what it is that you do. So don't be frightened of saying what you did, unless it's just so incredibly complicated that we have no clue whatever with it. So we are recruiting. There's tough competition because the charities are going through tough times, but they still absolutely need good people more than ever to help us through this crisis time. That's me.
Robin, thank you so much. Sorry, you mentioned the list, which is where you had advertised your role, but there was a question from Thomas Manson. Which recruitment agents engaged with for not-for-profit, and what's been your experience? So I wonder, from your perspective of recruiting, were there any other agencies, or when you were looking, whether perhaps you didn't use agencies at all, but would you recommend any in particular?
We've certainly used we've used Saks and Bamfield in the past, but they can be quite expensive, and in looking to sort of to save money, and you've got to, and they work across the charity, the not-profit sector, which is the joy of it, and they have the ability to search. I mean, I think if you're searched and found, then there's real value in that person being sort of nudged, getting the call saying, would you be interested in this role? And so we've certainly used, our charity used Saks and Bamfield, and I noticed that Forces of Mind Trust are using another search agency. We happened to use a list because it was deemed essential that my role would be filled by someone military, not exclusively, but it could have been and we went out very widely, the list went out very widely for my role, and actually ended up interviewing 33 people for, then bringing that down to a long list. But it needed, you can't do this particular role, and my particular role in this charity, without some military experience. And all the candidates had it in spades, but it's there are obviously other jobs where not so essential, and that's where, I mean, when we recruit trustees, we've been recruiting trustees through external headhunters, search agencies, and that's been incredibly interesting because they bring in some incredible talent who we could never possibly network with to get in. I mean, we've had the marketing director from eBay, became a trustee, that sort of thing. So brings in brilliant marketing experience onto the board, and that's worth paying a little bit of money to Saks BAM or equivalent, to get somebody. And certainly, I know that from Andy's experience, I don't know how Andy was recruited into his bursar's role, but in one of my other lives as a school governor, we were also recruited through Saks BAM for our bursar, called finance director actually, and that was really, really interesting because of the field of people that they were able to tap into. So it's horses for courses. I mean, the list is very, very good for anyone who's looking for ex-military people, former military people currently serving or having served. A number of candidates have been out for 2 or 3 years, but it was a very powerful search actually, and I was really, really pleased with it, and fantastic value for money for the charity as well.
Thanks so much, Robin. I'll move on to Andy now. Firstly, the question, how do you think the pandemic will affect? Perhaps if you could answer the question about recruitment agencies and which ones would you approach? Thank you.
Sure. I think, given my limited experience in terms of funding, I think it depends on how that organisation is funded. So when I left Macmillan, which was just prior to the COVID crisis, late last year, early this year, they were under increasing pressure around funding because as a charity, they were competing for the same pound that you and I would give to charities, alongside all the other charities. And that was prevalent across the charitable sector, in terms of more and more charities, more and more worthy causes, all competing for the same pound that donors are willing to give. And thus you can see then wind the clock forward now, where those fundraising events, those appeals have been constrained. There are fewer pounds around, or fewer opportunities around for charities to compete for, and that squeezes the pressure. Conversely, the 3 or 4 months I did working for Shore Trust, which is not a profit organisation, that helps deliver a lot of good programs in terms of rehabilitating our offenders, to helping young people back into employment or back into normal mainstream life. A lot of their funding came through government programs, and at the time, and it was during the first lockdown, the government was looking to increase their funding and make those programs more readily available, because lockdown and furlough was going to create more unemployment amongst young people, and thus they need to invest in organisations like Shore Trust to deliver some of those programs when we came out of lockdown. So they were benefiting from the crisis because of what they deliver. And conversely, the other extreme, given the diversity of the sector, working at a middle-sized school down in East Sussex, we're seeing more and more people come out of London and move down into the sticks of Sussex and Kent, outside of the inner London housing chain, because housing is more affordable, benefiting from the stamp duty relief, but also being able to benefit from I suppose cheaper independent education for their children as opposed to London rates. And thus, as a registered charity, we are seeing an increase in interest and expressions of interest in the school as a charity. So again, there's no one size fits all in that. In terms of job opportunities, as both Robin and Sally have said, there are opportunities out there. I think there is an increasing supply as more and more people are looking for change, or indeed have been furloughed, or indeed been made redundant because of the crisis, particularly from the charitable sector. But it comes back to the point I think I touched on, everyone else has touched on, is how do you differentiate yourself from those people who have perhaps got 10, 15 years experience in the charitable sector, how do you make yourself stand out? And you can, because whether it's a service charity or not, or a not-for-profit organisation, there's something that we bring that people who've got 15 years experience in the charitable sector haven't got in terms of their experience, their wealth of knowledge. It's just realising that, being able to articulate that, to be the game changer from the rest of the crowd. And that's no different from any job that you may be looking at. And I think, as Robin rightly articulated just now, there are opportunities for middle senior management, because those are roles which are essential in various numbers to keep businesses going. And unless a charity or not-for-profit organisation is really going down the pan, sadly, the likes of ABF, the likes of Macmillan, and smaller organisations still have a demand for good people to help their business change, evolve, and face these challenges that everyone's facing in the current crisis, and indeed in future. So look about the future. So never give up. And I think just on that point, in terms of where to go, I haven't got much of personal experience in terms of using agencies, headhunters. I've been perhaps the victim of some of that in terms of trying to use them to look for opportunities. There's some obvious places that people can start to look at to see what opportunities are out there. But again, word of caution, it's across the grades. I think it's called Charity Jobs, where most charities will advertise along with other places. The Guardian seems to be very popular with a lot of big organisations and charities in terms of putting their charity jobs out there. Just touching on the last point Robin made in terms of where I found this opportunity I'm currently in, there's the Independent Schools Bursar Association, which looks at not just bursar roles, but all kinds of roles, be it finance director role, be it operations director role within the independent education sector. So there are all these little niches and areas that people can look. And there's no one portal, which is really positive, because there are various portals that you could go to.
Andy, thanks so much for that. So I would just like at this point to mention that there are 4 jobs advertised on the OA jobs board. I sent them out yesterday in my email. Do have a look at those. We're posting more regularly all the time. There's a question I'd like to ask email yesterday. It'd be really helpful to understand the boundaries of the not-for-profit sector with diverse examples of the organisations within the sector. So certainly sort of talking about your own experience, I think you might be able to add some insights into that.
Yeah, it's one thing I'm learning, and I always sort of are very humbled by how diverse the sector is. And the caveat is, it is just a snapshot that I've got. There are people who've been working in the sector for a lot longer, and in many other organisations who probably have got greater experience. But I've done, so I'm doing 3 roles which are classed as not-for-profit charitable roles. One in a big national multi-million pound organisation, as is Macmillan Cancer Support, which is spread across the country, and as I said earlier, alluded to, has an income of over 240 million pounds, at least did this time last year, to a technically a not-for-profit organisation that's predominantly government funded in terms of what it does, Shore Trust, in delivering sort of rehabilitation, education, support programs for people who have fallen on hard times, who need that support to get back on to the life treadmill or work treadmill or well-being treadmill. To what is technically a charity, because we're registered with the Charities Commission of an independent school. So they're in 3 very different organisations that are deemed not-for-profit charity, and I'm sure there are more examples, just haven't got that experience with them. And each are very different, but I don't think it's any different if you then went into banking and then went into retail and went into perhaps consultancy. It's the culture of the organisations in the sector that you just need to be alive to. But there are huge opportunities in the not-for-profit charitable sector, just finding the right one for you in terms of what drives you and what motivates you.
Thank you so much. Sally, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I don't think so, to be fair. I don't have any broader experience, no. Thank you, though.
Fair enough. Thanks so much. And Robin?
Yes, I think overall, I mean, this is back about the question of bringing the relative experience from different roles. I mean, I stayed. I came into the charity thinking I'd do this for 2 or 3 years, see how I get on, and actually I realised how much I enjoyed it. And that's the thing. And whatever you do, and I think I suppose my most important bit of advice I can possibly give here is that you've got to do something you can enjoy and get behind. And if it's drudgery going to work, like itself, when I was put onto the Joint Personnel Administration project for a few months, that became a drudgery, which I think the military audience will understand. Actually, the joy of going to work and the fulfillment of helping veterans is incalculable, and so there's some real visceral moments where you get of enormous satisfaction. A couple of years ago, we were with a group in Ypres, as in wipers, Belgium, and I was asked by the local authorities to do the Lawrence Benyon reading. They shall grow not old. Under the Menin Gate on a Saturday night with sort of 2,000 people. I think, how on earth do you get that opportunity to do these things? But it was because of my role in the charity, and we were there at the right time, right place, and so on. And the privilege of representing the charity, the army, Britain, to be able to do justice to the Lawrence Benyon, They Shall Grow Not Old, in a place like that is you can't describe how exciting and rewarding that is. So you're not in it for the money, is the other thing I'd say. You're not going to get rich working in the charity sector. We should have covered that actually. Work-life balance can be quite distorted sometimes, especially if you're going out doing to events at weekends and so on, and hopefully you have some toil system, time off in lieu, but it doesn't necessarily always work. Make sure that when you are applying in the charity sector, that don't have any conversations where they say, "Oh, we know you're going to get a service pension," because that's nothing to do with the organisation. But it does have a bearing on HMRC and what you end up with in terms of what you end up with in paying tax, of course. So don't be fobbed off with, "Oh, well, you get a pension, therefore we don't give you very much." But don't expect a lot, because actually these charities, the money is there, that the money is raised for the beneficiary, not to pay and look after a well-heeled staff. It's so whatever charity you work for, whether it's Macmillan or whether it's a smaller charity or whatever, it's very much beneficiaries first. Obviously, you need to pay your mortgage or whatever you need to do. But there was famously one particular charity, who I won't name, who they paid for all their staff working overseas sometime. They paid boarding school fees. Now, I'm a great fan of the independent sector, but I don't think a charity should pay for that sort of thing out of charity funds. And I wouldn't give that charity any money if I knew that they were using their funds for that sort of purpose. So salaries won't be fantastic, but you're not on the breadline. We have this joke in the family of being on the ciabatta and sun-dried tomato bread line is different from the proper bread line of people in the most challenging circumstances. So you've got to enjoy it. You've got to be fulfilled by it. And if you don't, then move on to something else. That's my advice.
Thank you so much, Robin. And I would definitely concur. This has been my most rewarding of my life, working for the OA in the role that I do. So I agree. You just touched on something else, which is about international. There's a couple of questions that came in yesterday, inquiring about international charity organisations. I'm not sure if anybody amongst our group today has any expertise in that area. If you do, could you put your hand up? But otherwise, what I will do is take that one on notice, and there's definitely some work that we can do to provide you with people in our network, our contact network with that. So I'm going to now go through all the questions that have come in. Had a chance to ask yet. So I'm just going through them. You also touched, Robin, on the issue of work-life balance. And there was a question, what does it feel like in a not-for-profit sector? Would anybody just like to raise your hand if you'd like to answer? Thanks, Robin.
Well, I'll go first if I may. Yeah, so work-life balance is you've got to pace yourself, because actually you could work 24/7, 7 days a week, month in, month out, because there's always stuff to do. There's always more to do, but you have to pace yourself, no question. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, I remember the time of being a commanding officer, and going to the Balkans on tour, and I had all these officers doing, and all these wonderful warrant officers, and the engine room of the regiment was definitely the corporals, and the senior and the sort of junior senior ranks as such, and you relied on them to get on and do so much, do so much for you, and you work jolly hard on ops, but that's why you have post-operational tour leave and so on afterwards, because you're going around the clock 7 days a week. And it does take its toll on you. So in the charity world, you could very easily have a adverse work-life balance if you choose to let it get that way. But you have to impose sort of fairly strict rules on this. That I am going at such and such time on a Friday, and I'm not going to answer emails on Sunday night, and so on. You have to lay down some rules, unless you're in a complete dilemma. I mean, if I look back to March this year, we were working every day, 7 days a week, and clearly the summer months, we made sure we worked, but just to get us over that sort of threshold, which I think virtually everybody was probably working 7 days a week during that middle part of March, trying to get ready for for first lockdown and so on. And so clearly that's a crisis, and you adapt and you work and you do that. And some of my mod jobs were definitely, on call to Secretary of State on a Saturday night to answer questions for the newspaper the next day, sort of thing. And that takes its toll on you, and it exhausts you. So you've got to try and find a work-life balance and sort of lay down the rules and set out from the very beginning. I have a hobby, I have a life. And by the way, I play golf at the weekend, or whatever I'm going to do, or I go sailing, or do something. And make sure you have a balanced life. That's key, because it's too easy to get sucked into doing stuff all the time, because there's always something missing. I'm sure there's loads of stuff I could be doing on the database right now, but I couldn't be asked. Sorry, I'm not going to say that. I could be. I must do it, but my work-life balance is such that I'm going to defer it till next week. Forgive my French.
Robin, I'll move on to Andy now, please. Thank you.
I'm just smiling at Robin's French. I think it's no different from any other role or job I've done in terms of that work-life balance. One could say there's an expectation, just because you're paid royally in banking or the corporate sector, that you give your heart and soul to the job. And just because you're not paid royally in the charitable sector, relatively speaking, that you don't. I think if you're passionate about the cause and the purpose, regardless of what sector it is in the job that you do, there is a tendency to get perhaps sucked in and embroiled and wholly consumed in that job. And it's a question of how you manage that work-life balance. And less so now, just because of the nature of the role I'm in and the environment we're working in. But in my previous two jobs, there was an opportunity to work from home. Indeed, in Shore Trust, because we were in lockdown, everyone was working from home. And that's balancing your work and your life. But then similarly, it's about leadership in terms of when you send out your emails at weekends and what's the expectation from the staff and indeed your boss. And I don't think that's any different in any organisation. It's finding the right balance for you that works for you, and also managing people's expectations upwards, downwards and sideways in terms of getting the job done, and the old cliche of working smarter, not necessarily longer. And I think that is true across the working environment. That's all I'd really say in that.
Thank you. Any comments, Sally? It's a bit different for you, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a bit different, but it's the same in the sense that you do, all of those points resonate. But particularly for me, there probably isn't much balance, if I'm honest, and there hasn't been. But that is my choice, and I am at a particular stage and in a particular time. So it's important just to move from, as I say, where we are now to establishing the organisation, and I am putting that time and effort in the way Andy just, I am setting it up as a business. I'm not just setting it, just going after, I'm not reacting to, I can go for this grant here. I want a plan. Somebody's asked, and I'm very happy, Chris McGregor has asked about, I think I should take that offline, but I'm very happy, Chris, to talk to you directly, because obviously it's a whole subject in itself, and it only applies to people who want to set up their own charity. But I have developed, particularly over the last 6 months, there's phenomenal support out there or to access for information and to work out your own path through it. So I'm very happy to share, where I'm looking at various sources. But I'm equally now, in a sense, almost standing back and not just applying to any, because they take time, and that you have to be selective about where you put your time in applying for sources of income. For a startup, because if you go to rejection, then you've spent a lot of time and effort writing an application that's gone nowhere. But there definitely are sources, which I'm happy to share. There was another question that I just wanted to make a comment on, and again, Stephen Cartwright, I haven't got to the end of how one goes about digital marketing, but his question was, do you have to know about digital marketing and fundraising in the upcoming environment? And certainly my take on that is yes, and therefore it's something that I'm looking at. And if you were looking to do some training to make yourself more employable in this sector, in a formal role, I would suspect that some training in digital marketing and fundraising would be a useful place to go. And if you do, please tell me, and then I can work out how to employ you. So I don't have to do it and I can delegate. But that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Actually, I didn't see that question. So if any of the guests have spotted any questions they'd like to answer, please let me know. In the meantime, I'll just share a comment from Nigel Morton. It's not a question, but it's just saying he's currently on loan from the Royal Navy to the Sea Cadets as an area officer. The Sea Cadet Corps is a charity, as is each separate unit. So I have been working very much in the charity sector for the last few years. I'm looking to continue that. So I'd echo many of the comments and pieces of advice I've heard today. So because I cannot see any more questions that we've provided for you. I'm just flicking through to see, I can't see any more questions that haven't been answered. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add from our guests? No. Robin's shaking his head. Andy, any comments? Okay, Sally, you're speaking, but I can't hear.
Sorry, I was just checking the questions. No, but equally, I'm very happy if anybody thinks subsequently of something that they think I might be able to help with, if they want to come back to me either directly or through the OA. That would be fine.
The thing I'd say is good luck to everybody. I'd just say good luck to everybody. I hope this is useful and good luck going forward. Yeah, it's a whole new world. Thank you.
Sure, Ben.
And similarly, Joe, best luck to everyone. And if anyone wants to pick up on anything that I've covered, I'm not so sure I'll be able to pick up on anything that Robin or Sally have covered. Very happy to have a conversation with someone based on my sort of narrow experience that people wish to contact.
Thank you so much, and a big thank you to all of you who've shared so much of your insights and knowledge and experience. And thank you for all of those who've joined us. We're not actually quite finished yet, because I just have a bit more information to share with you. As you'll screen now, there is some information here about the Defence Garden Schemes, and Sally is looking for a couple of volunteers if you're interested. An operations manager role 2 days a week, and a comms, PR and social media role, as she's alluded to. She'd like somebody with some expertise in that, please. And I would like to just point out that Sally's email address is down at the bottom, and I'm sure she'd be delighted to hear from you. And could we move to the next slide, please? And again, this was also kindly provided by Sally. The rural link are looking for volunteers, well, a volunteering officer. And if you'd like some more information, please contact Fiona Galbraith. If you missed taking any notes, then please contact us and we can share slide, please, Victoria. As I said, oh, we've just passed them, but there were some, thank you. There are these 4 jobs advertised on the jobs board at the moment. And please keep an eye on that jobs board, because regularly we will have more jobs coming up that may be of interest. So just finally, to give you a heads up on the next couple of events that we've got running shortly, on the 25th of November, there will be another virtual employment forum, which is pretty much a full day event. And then the next webinar on the 2nd of December is setting up a small business and careers in the legal profession. So just put those in your diary if that's of any interest to you as well. Once again, a really big thank you to Sally Coutart, Robin Bacon and Andy Brown. Your information and insights have just been invaluable. I really do appreciate everything that you've shared with us today. And I'm sure that you will be inundated with the contacts after this event. Chris Stock has just sent a message thanking everybody as well. Just our contact details if anybody needs them. And on that note, right on the 12:30, I'm very impressed we haven't gone over time. I will say goodbye and thank you, and look forward to seeing you on our next event. Many thanks to Sally, Robin and Andy. Goodbye.